Yeah, we're live. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so welcome to round 8 of Nepal Australs. Without further ado, can you please have the first speaker from side affirmative?
Hi, can I be heard?
Yes, clear.
Okay, great. Okay, I've just closed the door. I don't know if you can hear the music. I sincerely hope you don't. But they're playing like this weird Filipino pop on the other side of the wall. So if you can't hear it, then I'm quite fortunate. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We believe education systems should teach children to stick it to the man. How do we think ideas of sticking it to the man will be integrated into the curriculum? The first thing is that, importantly, sticking it to the man is not blind anarchy or unguided rebellion. It is specifically rooted in the rise of punk counterculture in the 80s, which had very clear ideological goals like promoting the broader acceptance of previously disenfranchised groups, questioning authoritarianism, fighting back corruption, and criticizing unjust governance, like Green Day's American Idiot with the Bush administration, for example. We think this is likely to be integrated into existing civics and social studies classes, where you get an in-depth overview of this movement and its values. You're encouraged to be politically aware and free to criticize the state. Note, we are not just teaching about the movement itself, but also teaching it as a frame to analyze history and your lived reality. So for example, when in history classes, you learn how did Jimi Hendrix and domestic opposition to the Vietnam War effectively stick it to the man versus, let's say, the French Revolution, and did they stick it to the man? Why is this a likely way this value system will be taught? 1, it's in the interest of education systems to do it well. 2, it's just easier to explain this using a framework of justification as opposed to just teaching it out of nowhere. And 3rd is that this is an actual movement, not just a tokenistic fad, so there's some basis to teach it. To be clear, there are some parts of this world where this is already somewhat prevalent to some degree, where some education systems are more accepting of teenage rebellion and are more encouraging of challenging authority. And so when we use examples from there, it means that we are getting closer to an ideal world and that we would move even further in that direction. So this is just to ward off any concerns that, oh, you're using examples from the present day, therefore we're fine. Preemption 1, before I move on to my arguments. They might say this undermines the abilities of schools to maintain authority and teach values and lessons. First, I make the observation on the counterfactual that rebellions against schools can still come from a variety of causes, like the biological rashness inherent to adolescent physiology or an innate discontentment with all the inequality and suffering in the world. They have to contend that sticking it to the man, as the info slide implies, was a widespread and popular cultural phenomenon that may have happened regardless, and so they would have done so regardless. But we think the distinction is the lens through which schools teach it and the way in which they channel their discontentment. Note that this is a much better way of teaching them through pop culture, because rather than doing it to be cool or having bans attached to these ideas, you can teach underlying reasons for why questioning authority through the lens of history is important. It is important to teach students to channel this discontentment and to reject the blind acceptance of what is presented in front of us. This is good, as you will explain in our arguments, that the blind trust of students towards schools often allows for values to remain unchecked, and in any case, they may seek to rebel normally or in either side of the world, but a world where we teach them to productively channel the discontentment is a world where overall society is better and more equitable. Having said that, our first argument: education is obliged to teach you to critique the state you live in and undermine oppressive structures. First point: education has a few inherent objectives that are best met by instilling this value system. The first is that we want to give students the tools to improve their positions in life. And we often promote education as the key to success and want each generation that goes through the school system to be better than the one before. The problem is that for many students, there is no way to improve their lot in life directly without questioning the structures they live in. And this is especially true for minority groups, which are most likely to be targeted by state abuse, e.g. the police, e.g. zoning laws, etc. And we can only change these structures if we allow these people to start questioning the structures around them. So we fail our burden to students if we tell them that working within the system is the only path to success, and we correct that by providing them with an increased increment of alternatives. The second purpose is that schools are obliged to create citizens in the full functioning of the state. States exercise a great deal of control over your life and are only legitimated by the preference, aggregation, and democratic mandate of the vote. There are many forces that seek to make you apathetic so that you fail to exercise your control, either because you don't see it as important or because you're misinformed about the value of that vote. like opposing political parties that attempt to make you not want to vote, companies like Facebook that drown you in echo chambers. And so we think teaching students that this is a necessary part of being alive, of being a good citizen, is precisely one of the obligations of schools, just in principle. And thirdly, lastly, is that schools implicitly load you with values that you lack the critical tools to engage with. There are many things that are in themselves not a moral good, but schools have been used to teach as inherently good: patriotism, nationalism, family piety. And note that these are structural incentives for the man to build up these claims, for these claims to be associated with the man. The nature of a school is to be a state apparatus. And the argument here is not to say that these are always bad, but that when they are in question, blind nationalism, patriotism, and family piety are often incredibly harmful. Use an excuse for leaders with a cult of personality to do dangerous actions without reprisal. Can be exclusive to particular groups that fall out of common definitions of nationalism and of patriotism. So even if these were values, students are better able to question their specific features and where they should apply. In other words, it is a frame we use to analyze the values that schools teach, which is why it is generally good. These are broadly the principal goals. How do we think these manifest in the lives of students? First, students are more socially aware and less politically apathetic. They are more sustainably aware of issues of their time, and they learn to seek out this information by themselves and constantly question the narratives being pushed onto them. NEG cannot deny that this is a problem systemically, where in many states, the youth voter turnout is incredibly low and awareness on social issues is even lower. We think in parts of the world where analytical mindsets are encouraged in education and curricula are more progressive, like in Sweden, you have your Greta Thunbergs, you have your climate strikes in schools on Fridays, for the reason that students overall become more socially aware and thus are more engaged in order to speak out and have their voices be heard. Secondly, students become more empathetic, both to disenfranchised social groups, which is important when they eventually grow up and become people with power, but also in the short term with how they treat other students of minority backgrounds to make them feel more included and more accommodated for. We think this resolves to a society that first has more social action in general, which is good, moving in the direction of social liberty and improving civil rights for more people overall. But two is that unambiguous goods, if you presume that left-wingers and right-wingers both do this, unambiguous goods like the suffering of people in poverty, like the suffering of people in countries that are affected heavily by climate change, are improved, even if there are some things that may be partisan. On our side, things that are unambiguously good that people don't know enough about are substantially more empowered on our side and are substantially improved. Why is this an argument important? First, we illustrate that principally, the youth are systemically disenfranchised in terms of politics and are denied a voice. We empower them to seek out that voice for themselves by telling them that this voice is important in the first place. Two, that society today is on the verge of great political apathy. Companies are gaining more and more power over the views and opinions that we have, and it's important for us to be able to critique and challenge these things. And thirdly, is that in general, it's important to curb the oppression of states, both by making states afraid to do these things in the first place because they know there's a politically motivated and militated populace against them, but also because in actual instances of oppression, people speak up. At the end of this first argument, it is clear society is better overall, people are happier overall. Secondly, this also improves the quality of education as our second argument. First of all, students are more educationally engaged and willing to learn. There are so many reasons for students to feel discontent and like their education is divorced from reality, especially when it comes to topics of history which they view as too high up or boring. And comparatively, they're more likely to engage with these issues for a few reasons. One, they gain a feeling of personal agency over these issues and can envision themselves as the heroes because they're more able to feel a personal connection as the values in schools connect to their lived realities. Two, they feel like they're part of a broader group rather than loners and outliers, that if you are discontent with the same discontent that we outlined in the first part of our speech, then being able to collectively stick it to the man is what makes students feel less discontented and happier overall with their own lives, but moreover feel like they're more capable of actually initiating change for themselves. Thirdly, though, this also encourages teachers to question their own political biases and learn from their students in turn. Many old established teachers often have entrenched views and believe their version of the subject is correct. For example, white teachers who still believe the Civil War was an issue of states' rights as opposed to slavery. And on the comparative, we think students are given more agency to call out these views and participate in constructive discussions in schools as opposed to being in totally unmoderated discussions in status quo. But B, students are forced to preemptively check their own biases as they review their lesson notes and are preparing to teach it to their students. At the end of this speech, it is clear that on every conceivable grounds, affirmative wins this debate by improving the quality of society, social discourse, political participation, and education in general. For these reasons, affirm.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to invite the first speaker from side negative.
Awesome, just checking that I'm audible.
Yep.
Perfect. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. David says that messages of sticking it to the man are not of blind anarchy and rebellion. And factually, this is correct, but that does not require all civics teachers to teach this in an accurate manner, even if the curriculum is perfect, which it will not always be. Nor does it necessitate students to understand it in a perfect way or refuse to apply their learnings and map them onto harmful forces that ask you to undermine norms of democracy. We're going to explain why teaching kids to undermine political authority in democratic nations empowers groups that seek to use populism to undermine democracy, and why countries with bad democratic norms teach these messages in a harmful way that gives states more controls. But before that, a few responses that knock the affirming team's case out of the debate. The first claim they make is that this gives students tools to improve their own conditions in life. The first thing I would note is that this principle is contingent on actually improving students' knowledge, but there is a clear limit to this norm, right? Because civics classes already exist under the status quo. What they already teach is things like the importance of civic engagement, of voting, the political difference between parties, but also things like the balance and checks and balances of power between courts and legal systems. So what ACT actually has to demonstrate under this point is why sticking it to the man as a message and to teach that is uniquely improving things like turnout and all of the benefits they try to claim, especially if it leads students to learn that the system is rigged and votes do not matter. But importantly, I think there's a lot more work that the affirming team needs to do to explain why generic civics teachings are insufficient to claim all of the benefits they want, because telling students that voting is important is probably sufficient given that teachers are not going to radically change the way that they are teaching. If you believe teachers under the status quo that voting is important, then obviously it is likely that you still believe what they say. So we claim all of those benefits of voting. Then they discuss that people will start caring about the suffering of disadvantaged people. I think the first thing they have to explain is why this teaching will actually encourage teachers and people to care about minorities in particular, rather than teaching this as a historic norm that applied. But it is also unclear that teachers are teaching this in a way that is more effective than what is already happening under the status quo, which is students turning out in the millions and billions worldwide, listening to activists like Greta Thunberg and already doing advocation on their own. If anything, I think if you believe that teachers are teaching this in a perfect manner, students probably just see this as a lame gimmick from teachers and are less likely to engage because it loses all of the coolness of actually sticking it to the man and doing it in an effective way. The final thing they say is that students are happier at school. Like, this is such a tiny benefit, but it's also, note by their own case, limited specifically to civics classes. Literally nothing changes anywhere else. So we think all those educational benefits likely fall out of this debate, especially when you weigh them to our material. Why does teaching kids to undermine political authority in democratic nations empower groups that seek to use populism in order to undermine democracy? The first thing I'm going to explain is why there is a trend towards really good governance in most democracies. I think the first thing I'll say is just intuitively the number of democracies has obviously gone up in the last 3 decades. But I think what I would note specifically is that democracy, firstly, leads to conditions for economic flourishing because everyone can participate. So the most successful countries are normally all democratic nations, and that is incredibly good signaling. But also just the fact that democratic nations enshrine rights and people see benefits in being able to fully participate in society. It is difficult to take those benefits away once they are enshrined. The impact of this is that there is a very large number of democracies, but even shaky nations are moving towards better and better democracy every day. This is an important trend to protect if you want all of the benefits that the affirming team tries to claim, but also that we establish here. Why does teaching kids to stick it to the man undermine trends towards strong democracy? I think the first thing to say is that the maintenance of democracy requires people to actually have faith in political systems. This is because often political decisions that are made for a nation as a whole may not benefit you as an individual, but do improve societies. Taxes are probably the easiest benefit of this, but it means that people require having long-term faith in the system representing best interests for it to work. When people lose faith in systems like this, you get less participation in political systems and voting. You get more anger when people miss out on those benefits for themselves. More partisanship when people otherize the ones that are able to access benefits, which is especially important when things like globalization increase the importance of group identity as the benefits of different groups continue to clash. Having faith the system is doing what is right for democracy and for society as a whole is incredibly important. This norm specifically undermines it, because what this norm does is it sets up that under the status quo, schools, when they teach civics, say that the political system does work. The political system represents civic civic rights, people can expect that things like proper elections are occurring and are free. When you teach them to undermine political authority, I mean, sure, the info slide says that political awareness and questioning is part of it, but I think you look at the specific words of the phrase, sticking it to the man, literally says you ought to undermine the man, undermine political systems and authority itself. That is different to civic engagement, which is already taught. It specifically asks you to say that political authorities are doing something that is harm. I think especially then in instances where people feel that their interests are being underrepresented in favor of other people's interests, they see it as a failure of the authority and use that as evidence for why you ought to undermine them. But I think the other thing it does is it gives people access to the very language that populism uses in order to undermine the state and undermine democratic norms. So you use the language of elites or the swamp, making decisions that are not in the interest of the majority in order to protect their own interests, running on platforms of the authority being abusive of its powers. When you teach children to label these groups as corrupt, to label these authorities as not looking out for their interests, you give them access to the very language that populists are now able to implant their own ideas on, give children the perfect capability to map those ideas onto one another, and gives them the language not only just to believe that the system itself is bad, but that specific groups that hold power are bad. The Democrats are always illegal, evil, and undermining democracy. But note that systems of teaching children what this movement looks like lowers the bar for what it takes for kids to believe that something is going badly. The comparative is obviously that they have faith in these systems to represent them. So on things like issues of climate change, they engage within the context of the system itself, rather than calling the system corrupt, the system not looking out for them. The final thing to say under this point, though, is that labeling true activism as sticking it to the man also undermines its efficacy within good democratic states. The context being that youth often do really good activism within the context of the system. They have their own role model. Social media lets them learn about interests like the Gretas of the world are able to organize millions to march for democratic solutions. When you normalize calling any accountability, sticking it to the man, people characterize this activism as more extreme than it is. They say these kids are going through radical phases in their life, but it also encourages people to then seek out the most radical voices within these movements because it becomes an expectation. All of this means that it is unlikely that effective organization happens within this context because students are constantly put down. They're told they're just 16, they don't actually care or actually know about issues, and they tend to polarize. Even in instances where activism does occur within the context of sticking to the man, it is less effective because it gets underweight because it is oppositional to the system itself. So when Black Lives Matter say they want to dismantle policing, they are not listened to, they are ignored and told they're being radical. Finally, why countries with bad democratic norms teach these messages in bad ways. When these systems teach sticking it to the man, state schools are directly influenced by state curriculums, which are often dictated to them. That inherently demonizes these messages, right? It looks like incentives from the state to ensure the actions that warrant in undermining the political authority are demonstrated to be radical, literal anarchists who want total breakdown of society. The issue with this is that it imbues characteristics and like shared understandings of these movements that are rooted in a misconception of what is acceptable to fight against and whether it is even good to fight back. So in the best case for the affirming team, when kids try to engage with these movements later because they are exposed to these views from revolutionaries, it takes them time to unlearn these behaviors or expectations. But in the worst case, it may not even be possible to unlearn these behaviors because it gives them a formative view, meaning that it is the people who use the language of sticking it to the man are underheard. The comparative is obviously the first interaction they have with these movements is from the very language that activists themselves use. So when Hong Kong protesters say the state is literally lying to them, that is the first interaction you have that challenges existing beliefs and gives you a better framing. This is better because it gives people a revolutionary starting point we're so proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to invite the second speaker from Side Affirmative to continue the debate.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
All right. I'll just fix all my papers. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So the first thing I want to note is the very convenient context of on our side of the house, we are, teaching this in like really crappy schools, really crappy curriculums, and students don't internalize this very well. The first thing I want to note about this argument is any argument they make on civics, on history, are also likely to be poorly taught. So all the democratic values I will also rebut later as better protected on our side are also not effectively taught in classrooms. Insofar as you want to pick the worst context for AF, you're also probably picking the worst ones on neg, where you're also most likely to push towards extremes, also likely to push towards authoritarianism. They had to debate comparatives, not look at this one scenario, it's pretty bad in this one scenario. I would want to point out inherent differences between both sides and why we win those. And here's the second thing that flips why you have better education. So on both sides of the house, perhaps you have an equal quality of education. It's then about how students are better able to internalize that education. What we would note is that absent the ability to say you have to stick it to the man, students feel like education is becoming an increasingly obsolete institution because the lived realities outside in the world, all the harms that they see, especially with the rise of information from the internet and social media and the news that is becoming more and more accessible, it becomes unclear why what they learn that refuses to engage, that refuses to question the structures of inequality around them, matter at all in a world that is filled with so much suffering, when our side of the house, again, by nature of the motion and info slide, forced them to become more politically aware, as well as to question why these kinds of things happen to begin with. So, insofar as students feel less engaged, feel like their education matters less, it becomes less and less clear with equal quality why students are able to internalize it better. But in fact, I'd argue, David explains why you are likely to have a better quality of education on our side of the house, because you're able to learn from students, insofar as teachers are more likely to respect students acting out and questioning different things. And moreover, a lot of the complacency from tenured teachers who stay there for so long and therefore have the stature and authority that younger teachers also don't question, make these kinds of lessons worse. Secondly, these kids are seen as radical. What I want to note next is that David explains many independent reasons for why students would have likely wanted to become radical. And the nature by which this happens is one that is corrected on our side of the house, not on their side of the house, for a few reasons. One, look at all the parents saying their students are stupid and radical because they're learning this from Nirvana. They're learning this from all these stupid hip hop and pop and punk bands, which therefore makes it easier to discredit a lot of the genuine concerns students and young people are facing because they're learning them from people who know nothing about them, rather than affirming this to an educational institution that is more likely to have adults and parents that say that they will question them, more likely to succeed. But secondly, is that you are only able to understand different historical nuances, different like through the classroom, we are more likely to engage with these things on a very thorough level rather than a few songs, a few movies that you watch. And as a consequence, it also ensures a greater respect and authority for the people engaging in these radical actions because they're more likely to be knowledgeable about it. And therefore, questions that claim of kids know nothing, they are so stupid and they're unable to actually have a voice about anything. Therefore, education is what uniquely fixes that. At best, even if there was a push solely on our side to do these things, look at their examples. Like, I don't know why it's so bad that even if they're called being radical, that a lot of young people and students are starting to engage in the Black Lives Matter movement. In fact, what they don't respond to from David is that there are many concerns that only the youth is engaging in, precisely because they're the most likely to suffer from this. Things like climate change that are most likely to affect young people, and therefore adults who might be more politically enfranchised, but don't have as much reason to care since they have less at stake, are much more likely to be effective on our side of the house. Next, pretty whack populism argument. Two problems with this. The first is that protests, strikes, rallies are all part and parcel of your democratic rights. Their claim that these are things that just randomly question the democratic system, when these are good and inherent features of the democratic system, I think is important to be able to note. In fact, many votes are seen as protests. You can support non-conventional politicians. All of these things do not necessarily have to contradict democratic values. In fact, what I'd argue is, in all the contexts they claim, where there might be authoritarianism, where the votes could actually be rigged, a lot of the time, it's only student groups that have questioned the Awami League. It's only student groups that question martial law in the Philippines. And a lot of the time, it's therefore the ability to stick it to the man to that extent, or question specific administrations, that ensures that when there is an abuse of power that has already happened, you have a better ability to be able to question that. Secondly, populism in itself is not a good or a bad thing. I'd like to note that it's a political style of catering to the the common individual, framing yourself as a political outsider, all that kind of jazz. What that means, firstly, is that Bernie Sanders is just as equally populist as like a Modi. And therefore, it's unclear why having some degree of populist rhetoric in itself is a harm. But what I'd posit in this claim to flip their argument is that you're more likely to push people towards the Modis, the incredibly harmful right-wing nationalist populists on their world, for the reason that David already explains. A lot of the time, there are many things in the educational system, either because it has historically been taught in that way, or because they have been, used as perverse incentive by states, as state apparatus and ideological mechanisms to teach things that seem like inherently good values, but might not be, like nationalism, like patriotism. And a lot of the time, that's what leads to harmful, populism, because you believe that you have to bring back Hindu nationalism and our national culture in order to ensure that we can protect India from all these outsiders. You have to bring back a lot of the natures of very dangerous populist rhetoric, because these are based on illogical claims that have never been questioned in the past. Insofar as teachers never question these things, insofar as students never question these things, these versions of values that have been historically taught and continue to be taught throughout curricula are more likely to ensure that it becomes more and more likely you push people towards this right-wing nationalism. And I'd like to note, the simple gut check against this is that the people supporting these are not the most educated, are not the people who are very young. A lot of the time, it's people who are very old, people who are uneducated, and not to say that it's a difference in class, but it is to say that a lot of the time, these are things that are not given enough focus in an educational system. And therefore, starting to question these values is incredibly important as a consequence. They don't explain the nature of populism that exists. I'd argue it's more likely to be dangerous on their side of the house. But even if not, I'd argue there's so many things we just take in status quo as generally good, like the assumption that capitalism is the only system of economics that works, that the ability to take on the current democratic structure rather than questioning many of its flaws like gerrymandering, like the two-party system. I'd argue questioning these things generally too, because they lead to a lot of the harms of structural oppression that David explains, particularly for minority groups. In extension, I'll explain actually why minority students who are most likely to act out because they are angered by the man regardless, by their teachers, by their stature in life, that are likely to act out. The problem is on their side of the house. There's no educational system that espouses this as a value. And what happens there is when you have a Black student that says, why aren't you treating me the same as my white counterpart? It is more likely that the teacher says, not that this is a value and it is expected, but rather that the student is acting out, is rebellious. And if they would have acted out on either side of the house, because they would have been angered by these systems on either side of the house, it is much more likely you ruin the educational outcomes because teachers don't like them. They label as troubled kids, but also in the place where that's most likely to happen, i.e. underfunded Black schools, you have a reason to further underfund them because you think you're not funding students who actually want to learn, rather than in a world where we accept that these are things that are part and parcel of the educational system to undermine authority. For all these reasons, their main claim on populism is both a very convenient context and one we flip, but secondly, they have no reasons to explain why the current nature of education is likely to continue to be relevant. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to invite the second speaker from side negative.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, clear.
Yeah, cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We think that schools do a lot more than just education. And we think a lot of the fundamental parts of education, the sciences, the literature, the mathematics is not changed at all by this debate. But the biggest role that is changed in this debate for schools specifically is not about the children that side affirming is focusing on, but what those children become, right? The citizens that they become. And what changes fundamentally is faith in democratic systems. We think that democratic systems are good, and as history has shown us, the long trend towards democracy is actually increasing. Populism comes and goes in waves. The harm that side affirming actually incurs in this debate is that they make that kind of shift much harder to do and leads to more backsliding that harms people in the short term because they undermine faith in the system itself. I'm going to discuss this at length and broaden this debate a lot into the long term of democratic structures, comparing different contexts. But before that, I just want to deal with the educational outcomes that they brought to us. The first thing to note, like what we heard at first, affirming, right? That individuals are more likely to get engaged in the education that they're involved in is unlikely to happen in the majority of instances where education matters, right? It only necessarily might happen in like history when you are able to like, see yourself as the hero, but it's unlikely then that you're able to translate that into any sort of other outcomes. All those outcomes in terms of social change rely then on the other mechanisms that we brought to you and that clash that we'll get into a little bit, right? So even to the extent that you teach history slightly better, unclear why you get a massive change to education, which means that the principal framework that David brought to you, right, that you want, it basically tells you to deprioritize education because education has a lesser impact on this debate and impact on democracy and the flow-on effects to individuals and societal change, but also schools are most important in creating those kinds of citizens. How does that change now the meat of this debate? The first thing to note is in terms of how this message is actually taught and internalized by students. Note, this is the nuance that wasn't responded to by Mikko by trying to claim that it's mutually exclusive. The difference is in terms of teaching individuals civic duties is that it's relatively simple to teach them that you should go out and vote, and there are other structures around both by the government as well to try and improve turnout. Political parties themselves also try and improve turnout a lot. What is different here is that, yes, you might give some analysis as to why curriculums are going to be good in certain instances, like, okay, obviously not in the bad instances where Modi is unlikely to teach political de-establishment when that might undermine the Hindu National Party. But even in instances where the curriculum is good, teachers are not necessarily going to teach it with that same level of nuance, right? Because teachers are often, and this is very true in the majority of the world, tired and overworked, teaching the same lesson over and over again, are unlikely to make the nuance as to when political dissidents and why undermining political authority is only okay in certain instances. When should you trust the state and when should you not trust the state is unlikely to be the hot topic of discussion in the classroom. But even to that extent, the point at which they learn their first exposure into this idea of sticking into the man are when they're children, right? And by David's own analysis, they're distracted, they're bored, they're disengaged, they're latching on to catchy things like sticking into the man without necessarily the nuance of how to actually engage with this in real life. But secondly, when looking for places to get rid of that discontent, side affirming fails to explain why they're likely to go to good things in their world as opposed to in our world. Because I think the status quo, walks a fine balance there, right? Where you have things in social media and Greta Thunberg, those kinds of things, those kinds of factors that lead people into seeing social issues, but the way that they disengage their engagement with that social issue is broadly through the system, which we think is a good thing to do, to go out and vote for that system and in that system itself, as opposed to undermining that system, which leads to that kind of disengagement. I think an additional layer here is in terms of figuring out where to show the blame around like the factors that people are facing when they see things like populism that matches up with their expectation that the political authority is the bad thing, that is the man that we should stick it to, as opposed to the nuances around what is causing that dissatisfaction, right? The economic factors that mean that immigration results in different in some displacement, the fact that displacement is happening just because we are developing further into creative destruction. That's why people are losing jobs. The easiest response for citizens who grew up learning that the political system might be at fault, or most likely is to be at fault, is to latch onto populist narratives as opposed to narratives that are more beneficial that might exist on our side of the house. I want to do a bit of framing here. The first thing to note is that democracies are prevalent and the long-term trend is towards democratization. The first thing to note here is that democracy has worked. It leads to particular economic flourishing, provides essential rights that people have gotten used to, and that means countries upon countries are further and further being democratized, no longer becoming monarchies. Autocrats as well are failing to a certain extent. To the extent that you have populism, it comes in waves, but the broad trajectory of society is one that is very positive. Any failings in the status quo are caused by a loss of faith in the system, right? Which is caused by the solution of this is through civic engagement and civic education. So going to school that tells you that you should take part in the system works, you need to trust the system, is what will lead to democracy actually working, because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't think the system is working and you disengage from the system, or you actively try to undermine the system, your actual predictions happen, right? Because that's when you get polarization, that's when you get deadlock in Congress, that's when you actually again reaffirm that loss of faith that you have. So side affirming undermines the solution, because now teaches in addition that you should undermine the system, or that system is not always correct, or you should at some instances undermine that system without necessarily teaching them the nuance of when to do it. But I think, as we proved at Umbar, actually exacerbates the problem to a certain extent. So note, the radicalization of students, or seeing students as radical, not necessarily about students, but about the citizens they become. So a lot of that analysis is not necessarily strategic in terms of the outcomes that citizens have after they learn this viewpoint of democracy at schools. But we think that it's much easier for students to not be radical under our side of the house. So maybe you shouldn't respect radical individuals. Maybe it should be a high bar as to what it should take for you to go up against the state, right? So Black Lives Matter engagement and climate change engagement is the status quo, right? It's about how they approach the solution to those things. So we think they should go out and strike, they should go out and vote, as opposed to doing things like disengaging and saying the problem is the state itself, and then voting for people. And this is why populism is inherently different from Bernie Sanders, voting for people that want to undermine that, right? So voting for people who are like that democracy doesn't work, democracy has failed you, a strong man that can take away democratic values, undermine that to a certain extent, and provide those outcomes. And that's why those things aren't symmetric, and why Mikko's lazy analysis at that point means that they're already losing this debate. Because even to the extent of like education fixing or creating nationalization, that is not going to change in this debate, right? Those other factors still exist. What depends is whether you trust the system or not. So to the extent that states are using the education to create bad outcomes for society, those are the very same states that we told you aren't going to use this really well, but instead undermine any sort of social progress against the state by undermining what it means to stick it to the man, unresponded to, which means it's only in instances that where states actually care about democracy. Now you're emboldening factors that undermine it. So what's new is undermining political authority, and therefore it's not symmetric, because it's easier to teach a base level civic duty on our side, and social media movements already create the level of engagement that they wanted to talk about. So undermining trust in society, unresponded to from Umbar, which results in a lot of harms to the loss of faith in society, more polarization, and more abilities for populists to come in and undermine democracy that is irreversible in the long term. That means at the end of this debate, you are weighing up small benefits towards education and some extra elements of like turning up to push for outcomes, but in no way does it mean that you're likely to get it if you're so radical. But even the success of those radical groups often undermines the very democratic foundations that we should be fighting for.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to invite the third speaker from side affirmative.
Hello, I'm going to assume I'm audible. Just tell me if anything's wrong. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. The greatest gift we can give our students is the ability to think for themselves. The assumption of the negative team has been that the system is good, to which we ask, which system? Because the negative team at this point, and their win condition at this point, is literally you believing that democracy will be undermined in the Western world if we start teaching kids to be more politically aware, to question certain systems but not all of it, which, as we say, is the most likely counterfactual, because these are movements grounded in reality rather than the populist, vague populist sentiments that they want to champion and they believe will dominate on their side. I want to talk about 3 issues to dissect this debate clearly. So first, how this is likely to be taught and what the counterfactual is. Next, how this impacts broader society. And third, how this impacts students and the education they receive. But before that, there are 2 tensions that I think need to be called out because they just undermine the negative case. 1, they cannot say that this is both boring and uncool and that it will turn students into radical populists. Obviously, if your frame and the biggest harm you champion in this debate is that students become radical populists, you admit that they are far more engaged with the educational system in our side, they're far more willing to internalize those facts, and the impact on their life is large. If you say it is boring and uncool, we ask how that is any different from status quo, at which case the margin is non-existent in your side. The second big tension I want to call out is they cannot conveniently shift between educational contexts. E.g., the tendency of their side is to argue that in our world, teachers are always tired and overworked and always unable to teach this in a good way, where in their world, they're all competent civics teachers who never have any sort of progressive ideals they pass on, who never have any misconceptions about history they unknowingly pass on, who never silence the opinions of their students, even when those things are valid. I think this incredible lack of charity from them just demonstrates how they aren't able to engage with the heart of our case, and which is why we win on face. Let's firstly talk about how this is likely to be taught. Next case is contingent on you believing that students will believe that they should derail all systems, all democratic norms, but they don't give you any real proof of that. We explain why it's likely that they are accurate and targeted to the systems that are oppressive, which these movements target in the first place. And that's for two reasons. First, because this is tied to history, real life social movements, and the values they held. We aren't teaching them to stick it to the man in the abstract. We give you a quite detailed explanation of what this is likely to look like from David. The vast majority of these movements were progressive. The vast majority of them were critiquing specific forms of oppression, and importantly, specific systems, rather than every system that exists, which is incredibly unlikely and honestly infeasible for a movement to critique in their world. The next big problem with this is they assume that the current establishment or the man is perfectly democratic on their side. They want you to trust the system, as they say. But in the vast majority of states, that simply isn't the case. Even in the most progressive and democratic countries like the US, there are many areas where democratic norms fail us. Many times when the people in power are able to abuse those to get into power unjustly, to disenfranchise and silence the voices of the oppressed, we don't think we need to question every single democratic norm, because there is something that is quite clearly wrong right now, and we need to return to a correction of what is right. Importantly, their own counterfactual as a third response brings them down, because they want to stand behind promoting this broader idea of civic engagement, which I think is incredibly vague coming from them. One, we point out this is insufficient. Not only is there a lack of personal connection in that you are unsure why you have any role in the system, instead are just taught to trust a bigger system that is often seen as bigger than you and as an establishment that you have no control over. But second, the fact that there's no framing of agency in this version of the world. So sure, you might think voting is important in the abstract, and it's good in the abstract because you're taught it in civic engagement classes, but you don't see any reason why you as an individual need to vote unless you're taught to outcomes of decreased apathy in a world where civic engagement is taught. But finally, I want to point out they're just uncomparative with this counterfactual. And this is where I want to flip a lot of their points. If civic engagement is taught in a way that you want and that encourages the same behavior, it's either the case that the same tools can be used to teach our world and our version of the narrative quite clearly, or it is the case that the same populist rise happens on your side of the house. Because if it's as engaging as people say, and people are taught to trust the system, it's unclear why they don't just gravitate to a different brand of populism, as we illustrate exists from Mikko, that is more authoritarian, more prone to giving the state control, says things like you should trust the police, you should trust the government, and you should trust authorities around you, which is also a version of populism that they fail to contend with till this point. So that first issue takes them out quite nicely. Secondly then, how does this impact broader society? I first want to take out the claim that this will be used by authoritarian states to entrench control. First, obviously that doesn't work. In that state, they are the man. Duterte isn't going to teach you to, Duterte isn't going to be able to entrench his own control by teaching you to question Duterteism. That simply doesn't stand. Oh, this recorded, I'm dead. But secondly, the ability to do this is far greater when the message is an apathetic civics course that the system works. So if it's about authoritarian cases, at least in our world, students are taught to question some systems which are problematic, whereas in their world, they're taught to constantly trust the system, and that claim is reinforced. The next thing I want to deal with is Mikko. It is the populism case that Mikko flips quite nicely, and we don't hear a proper response to. What does he say? First, he tells you populism isn't de facto bad. It's about the type of populism that individuals are likely to gravitate to. We say it's incredibly unlikely that they view authoritarian populism, which is the kind of thing they want to derail against, authoritarian populism, which tells you that it's okay to remove checks and balances because the system is working anyways, as the solution if they're taught to question authority in the current world. It's more likely that they promote a more liberalized system that grants individuals more control rather than one that grants the state more control. But second, it's about their ability to curtail the worst forms of radicalization, because people will continue to feel discontent on their side, especially when their views of the world aren't legitimized in the classroom from a young age. What changes then is our ability to correct our misconceptions. So it's in their world where the least educated individuals gravitate towards harmful norms like saying that immigrants are the problem of the country by blaming ethnic minorities in the state, rather where in our world we say there is a other problem with the system and we can direct them to the actual factual evidence that exists. The final thing I want to take out is this strange claim about how it weakens activism. First, honestly, I'm not sure how it weakens activism when activism becomes more of a norm in our side, because people no longer view it as something that is on the fringes, but rather that is something that is normalized within the educational curriculum. But secondly, the impact just doesn't flow from their argument. So even if these people are viewed as radical, it's unclear why that weakens activism as a whole. If anything, it shifts the Overton window and makes you more willing to make moderate concessions to other groups of that activist movement, e.g. as we've done with climate change and many other social movements in the past. Finally then, how does this impact students and the education they receive? We give you a series of impacts that are brushed aside by negative. The first thing we say is that sticking it to the man is often the only mechanism by which students, especially the most disenfranchised, can improve their lot in life. You have to question the system. You have to turn out the vote. You have to question the merits of whether or not we should trust the police, of whether or not the politicians in your town are actually using democratic norms properly, or whether they're using them in corrupt ways to entrench their power. You have to question at the micro scale whether or not the white teacher disciplining you is doing it out of genuine intent, or whether they are doing it because they have their own racist conception of the world that they simply cannot move past. For these students in their world where they are constantly taught to question the system, there's no way for them to release this anger except for the bad actors we describe, or the alternative of apathy, which is just far worse. Insofar as these people are the most vulnerable students in the educational system, we think we have an obligation to them. But secondly, we explain that it's about improving what is taught in schools. There are many values that go unquestioned and unchallenged that we think teachers need to change on their own, that can only happen when you force them to question their own values at that stage in the educational system. For all of these reasons, we are proud to affirm.
Thank you for your speech. I'd like to invite the third speaker from side negative.
Four things from me today. Firstly, about social change. Wait, sorry, can you hear me? Because the Zoom thingy's not gone yellow.
Yep, you're clear.
Oh, wait, okay, I'll just restart.
Yep, sure.
Okay, four things from me. Firstly, I'm going to narrow the affirmative team's benefits in this debate. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the harms that actually accrue when they teach us in schools. Thirdly, I'm going to defend how we get change on our side of the house. And finally, I'm going to deal with educational outcomes. So firstly, narrowing affirmative's benefits. The first thing I want to point out is that they've just said that this debate doesn't apply to countries that are not already democratic, right? Firstly, I want to say that that means they're going to prove much less significant impacts and much less changes. But secondly, I would say that the material we gave you at Umbar still stands, and that was an actual harm about how this becomes a tool for schools to uniquely indoctrinate kids against social movements, right? And I think that still stands for us. But the next thing I want to do in this point is just say that obviously we can still vote to encourage kids to turn out and, you know, be politically active without necessarily having to teach them to stick it to the man, right? And this doesn't revolve around schools. This revolves around youth, targeted campaigns by political parties that depend on the youth vote. For example, left-wing parties, right? This is about, role models on social media that speak out to youth and want them to get engaged because that's the cool thing to do, to be politically engaged these days. And I think turnout is still pretty good. So their huge benefit they're trying to prove in this debate is that suddenly they make a whole heap of teens who already exist in democratic countries, who already hear from lots of sources that should go out and vote. They teach them to just be more radical and more questioning. I don't think that's a huge win in this debate. Now let's talk about the harms that actually happen when the affirmative team introduces this policy, right? So we told you there were two harms that accrue. Firstly, you highly increase the risk of populist parties being voted in more frequently, and that undoes any progress that activism groups work for. But secondly, you also push these groups to be more radical, and that undermines them as well. First thing I want to flag before I get into either of those harms is that the affirmative can't actually model that they're going to teach this perfectly, right? Because when we went to school, we didn't remember everything that the teachers taught us, right? You just remember the name of the topic and a few key points. And then a few years on, you remember even less, right? So even if they teach it in the best way possible, what sticks with kids is probably only the headline, which is sticking it to the man, which intuitively means you should fuck the system, right? Okay, what are the two harms then? Firstly, populism. What did we hear from the other team? We heard that populism isn't always bad, right? And that we're channeling the people to choose the right kind of populist leaders. The populist leaders they're talking about are just like democratic leaders, right? But crucially, what we told you was that the unique harm in this debate is that you teach like privileged white kids that they should be suspicious of the man, you know, because the man might be infringing on their rights. And so you actually invite a whole group of people who are not actually harmed by the system. You teach them to, you know, understand the language of populist leaders who are like, you're suffering as a white cis man in America. You should be suspicious of the system. The leftists are taking over. You know, you empower that group uniquely and you lead to more populist waves, right? The next thing we heard is that, you know, voting for populist leaders is actually takes place within the democratic system. So it's not necessarily related to this anarchist language, but actually I would say that even if that's true, populist leaders tend to use the kind of language that is about, you know, disrupting the system and draining the swamp. So even if it's true that it doesn't require disrupting the political system, I still think that the rhetoric which uses is the same, right? And third affirmative tries to say that, you know, in school, you're going to learn about specific systems, right? So you're not going to associate this current situation with what you learned about in school. But actually, I think this is untrue. Firstly, because Pizzagate sounds a lot like Watergate. But secondly, because I actually think it's very easy for leaders to just say, hey, this is the problem we're facing today. It's slightly different from the problem we faced 10 years ago. And you'll just believe that, right? Finally, I just want to deal with stuff we heard back at David, which is about how people will just learn empathy. And I want to just talk about how they've only said that you're going to teach this in civics or history classes, right? So maybe that's like 3 hours a week. It's not like entirely teaching time or lecturing time. A lot of it is just you sitting around doing exercises which aren't directly related to learning about injustices. I think they haven't done enough work to show you that they create this huge wave of empathy that doesn't already exist from just learning about, you know, the civil rights movement. Why does sticking it to the man specifically create more empathy? Don't know at this point in the debate. You know, and so finally, just a note on actual evidence still existing. And, you know, I just think when you create a generation that is deeply suspicious of authority, that is deeply suspicious, they're more willing to believe in conspiracies, populism becomes a more real and more common threat, and that undermines any benefits the affirmative team gets in this debate. The second harm we talked about was about groups become too radical. The only response you heard was from Mikko, who said that it's actually harder to discredit radical groups if they're, you know, being taught or legitimized by educational systems. Actually, I would say it's far easier to discredit children when you know that they're just doing what they've been told, that this isn't a legitimate issue, they've just gotten ideas in their heads, right? Another response we hear from third affirmative is that if there are some radicals, that shifts the Overton windows, so you become more accepting towards moderate versions of that voice. Actually, what happens is the media tends to conflate all those groups together, right? So that's why in the Black Lives Matter riots, you didn't hear about like, oh, the rioters and the good guys. You just saw the worst destruction because there's a tendency to focus on the worst stuff. People have a very basic view, so I don't think that Overton window shift happens. That's also a harm. Thirdly, let's defend our counterfactual. We gave you analytical reasons why there was a trend towards democracy. That was about economic flourishing from full participation. That was about how rights have been enshrined. And this was about how people need to have faith that even when they don't individually benefit from democracy, that society is still functioning as it should. We heard two pieces of pushback from the other team. Firstly, they said populism already happens, so that shows that democracy is being undermined. Populism happens in waves and there is a feedback loop, right? So I think that's not necessarily an indicator that democracy is on the decline. But then David sort of hints at this thing in their speech about, you know, tech creating more apathy. I obviously think tech leads to increased scrutiny, right? Because you have the ability for everyone on the earth to pick up their phone, to take videos, to share them, and for those videos to go viral. Tech is actually a tool of political engagement in the future. It has led to more scrutiny, right? So now let's defend the kind of activism we get on our side of the house. I think the only real material we've heard from the other team here is some idea that, you know, the youth won't care, you know, they'll be apathetic, you know, but obviously that's not true, because all the examples the affirmative team has used about Greta Thunberg, about Black Lives Matter, took place in a world where the American educational system, and not even the Swedish educational system, were teaching their children to stick it to the man, right? Obviously, this happened because kids have access to the internet, they have their own role models, they have social media, they care about the world. That's why this still happens, and it's hugely prominent. But then they try to say, oh, they're just doing it to look cool. They don't recognize why this is bad. I actually think teens are intelligent, they are self-correcting. I think change is important. We still get people to turn out and vote for the issues that matter with none of the harms that accrue. Finally, on educational outcomes. motivation isn't going to be hugely increased because it's only taking place in one class. I don't think that transfers over to learning about maths or English with more enthusiasm. But then all the stuff about educational systems becoming more forgiving of angry minority students, I would just say that to the extent that they care about that teachers are humans who care about children, I would say they are already understanding of those children's situations. It's highly unlikely you just have lots of white teachers in a Black majority ethnic area, right? But I think if they're so racist that they treat those students badly, little change will happen in terms of education. Crucially, I just want to point out all the principled reasons that David gave you for caring about, societal change over education undermine any of the stuff that the affirmative team has tried to pivot to. Thank you.
Hi, small change in the roster. I'm doing reply.
All right, noted. Thank you for that speech, and I'd like to invite the reply speech from Sandhu first.
Awesome. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to focus on the best case for side affirming. So even if they're able to teach this in a relatively good manner and a manner that matches with the goals that they wanted to achieve, why do they still cause more harms than good? The first thing I want to discuss is what actually changes in schools' civic education. Note that the status quo, schools do teach civic duty, how to be politically aware, how to actually engage and question things in the environment around them. And I think Mikko actually agrees with me on this instance because he talks about how people can see they're discontented in how they're taught because they can see problems through social media. So that already means that they're politically aware, right? The discontent then is a chicken and egg problem as to whether the ways of how to use that discontent and how to actually achieve change is all dependent on how the school will teach them to do so. So civic duty, turning up to vote, is done by schools, but also done by other alternatives, as I brought you in my speech that weren't responded to. What is uniquely new then inside affirming's world is the idea that you stick it to the man that is undermining political authority, which necessarily says that the above other things that are already the status quo and already there in society isn't enough. Otherwise, it's unclear as to why students are going to understand why sticking it to the man is important, right? So for example, you teach them the past and history as they say, but the history that they're teaching is something that is fundamentally different from the present, that was fundamentally less democratic, given my analysis about how democracies are gradually evolving and becoming much stronger, given that individuals have more rights, that the institutions get much stronger. So you teach them about things like Watergate. The question then, is it necessary then to undermine political authority to get change? The first thing that they say is to fight authoritarianism. That is at first affirming, right? Where there is no or less proper democracy and you're able to get that change. Umbar explains why states that are authoritarian or have authoritarian tendencies and do have a lot of control then over the school and state schooling system, that the fact that they co-opt and dilute this message is particularly bad and undermines any sort of other organic ability to fight for democracy. So that then leads side affirming to say, hey, this is not the context we're debating in, it's out of the debate. So that firstly undermines any actual instance that is most important in undermining political authority as opposed to working with the system and voting for things. The second thing they say is that sometimes democracies aren't perfect, that the only way to improve it, for example, fighting against race institutions, is to undermine the political authority, to undermine, if the political authority is democracy, to undermine democracy. So if democracy does exist in those instances, because obviously we're not talking about the authoritarian instances, then society is either apathetic to the plight of that individual or racist in and of themselves. So that's where our analysis as to why being radical, first of all, doesn't work, but further isolates that movement. And that all came up at Umbar to no response because they tried to weasel out of that by explaining why you're unlikely to get that kind of social movement on our side of the house. But no, the harm means you undermine all the social movements and alternatives that exist. So that's why violence for the BLM movement doesn't actually bring change, but voting for AOC actually does bring change. So it's about where students are likely to, or citizens are likely to take that approach as opposed to the violent approach that doesn't get any sort of change, a lot of stuff that was unresponded to. So the context that do matter is where democracy exists and there's an ability within democracy to get change. So in that quest to teach kids about Watergate, that superimposes a more democratic present with a not so democratic past. So you are more likely to believe then that the Democrats took the election away away from Trump because you're less likely to trust the political authority that's telling you to believe in them, to trust that system. You're less likely to trust the opposition because you don't trust in the system itself, right? So you are a Republican then against a Democrat, or a Democrat against a Republican, not the system itself that we trust in democracy, that the amalgamation of preferences will result in good outcomes, at least in the long term. So you're more likely to perceive short-term harms, right? Like depressed jobs and blame it on immigration because you perceive it as the state not necessarily telling you things, and therefore you're more likely to vote for the bad authoritarian populist. That itself alone is a harm that wins us this debate. But add on to that everything you just heard from Grace, how the message itself can't be taught that well, and therefore the most extreme elements are likely to be used to feed into misinformation, to feed into that harmful population that depresses democracy, the very thing that they wanted to support.
Thank you for that speech. And to conclude the debate, reply speech from side affirmative.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes.
All right, hold on. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Neg's answer to an angry child that is discontented with the state of the world is trust, and listen to the civics class because that'll be enough. They think that sticking it to the man is always some absurd conception of rejecting anything and everything, and not at all that teachers can potentially teach kids to do this in other ways. I think these kinds of characterizations are not only uncharitable, but ones that also are unlikely to manifest in good methods in their side of the house, insofar as teachers are so incompetent, so generalizable, and nothing sticks to children apparently. Then why the hell do these civics classes work? The first thing I want to point out is that Neg conflates authority with democracy, when clearly I just don't know why this is true. 3 analytical reasons we provided already. Number 1, we said people are currently disengaged because they feel like there is a disengagement between the real world realities of suffering and inequality and the need to do something about this, and the lack of a systematic alternative and method of being able to deal with these things. So I think what we specifically point out at third F is why that doesn't encourage civic duty, i.e., why vote if you can trust things in the system to be able to correct it? Why be more politically aware if you can just trust that things are going to work out and that it's not your responsibility because you think that those in power have it under control? So even if you taught these kinds of rights, it's unclear why they stick at all insofar as you don't teach a distrust that first is initially important. Secondly, they never explained why the system was good. And I want to note that our argument was not just that the system was bad, but that there are many features of the system that are bad, and the most likely ones where anger is directed, where teachers are most likely to point out what you should correct, are the ones that are likely to be abusive. And David also points out in a very nuanced way, even if the right and the left disagree, there are some things that we have to structurally enforce because there is a consensus that these things are bad, i.e. poverty, climate change, etc. So what is important about this is that 1, trusting the system does not solve the problems we name of an abusive police, does not solve the problems we name of the same 2 political parties remaining in power, and therefore just allowing them to continue to do so rather than thinking maybe we can vote for an outsider. And this is important, not just because it is a rebuttal to that, but also because I think they just always assert that sticking it to the man is always going to be some radical, violent kind of expression, when clearly it can manifest in trying to work away from the system, not just by doing everything that they rejected, but also working against convention, working against norms. And we've given so many examples of this already. Guys like Bernie Sanders that aren't a conventional Democrat and saying that these kinds of political outsiders are good to vote in as well. But next they just say, school's bad, kids dumb, they'll just get mad at everything. And therefore, 1, again, fails the counterfactual. 2, contradicted a third neg who says kids are fairly intelligent. But 3, all the alternatives of learning it from the internet, learning it from bands and pop culture are clearly not as good as trying to learn it from teachers who probably have more expert and going to teach it from a lens. Even if they're not perfect, they're far better than those alternatives. Thirdly, we gave a framing as to why this populist harm that they explain is more likely to occur on their side of the house because of David's analysis, which explains that you are less likely to have this right-wing nationalistic populistic leader when you question values that are seen as a priori good when they might not be, like nationalism and patriotism, which we also explain schools have an inherent perverse incentive to teach by nature of being a state apparatus. All these things debunk that larger harm. Next is, even the harms on student activism, I feel, one, I don't think they explain why radicalism is so bad, but two, it's more likely to be respected when it's affirmed by an educational institution. I think at best gets a flippant response from Third Neck to say people still won't respect it. When we say it might have happened either way, at least now you have the backing of an educational institution. Lastly, there's very little response to our argument as to why it's better for minority children, in which they say, well, if they're racist, they'll still be racist. Obviously, this matters on extents. So in the borders, or when you're more likely to get some degree of change, that's where this kind of argument applies, not just people will continue to be racist. I think working within nuance, working within the moderate context is what wins us the debate. I'm very proud to propose.
Right, that brings an end to the